Madison, the Black Star Project, Sharon, Richmond, determination made this possible. Harold Lucas of the Bronzeville Visitor Information Center, I want to thank him as well, and the Hartzell Memorial Church for allowing this event to be held. No words can truly express how grateful I am for all that you have done to make sure that the message of this book gets heard. When I wrote this book, I knew that the mainstream media wouldn't touch it. I knew that if this message was going to be heard and was going to reach the people who needed it most, it was going to take a grassroots effort. It was going to take committed souls coming together through word of mouth, holding events like this to ensure that the message was heard. Thank you for making that dream, a reality for me. I'm more hopeful than I have ever been that we will succeed in ending mass incarceration and the history and cycle of racial caste. This book is not for everyone. That's the first sentence of the preface to the book, before you get to the introduction. It reads, "This book is not for everyone. I have a specific audience in mind. People who care deeply about racial justice, but who, for any number of reasons, do not yet appreciate the magnitude of the crisis faced by communities of color as a result of mass incarceration." In other words, I'm writing this book for people like me, the person I was more than 10 years ago. I'm also writing it for another audience, those who have been struggling to persuade their friends, neighbors, teachers, relatives, co-workers, or political representatives that something is eerily familiar about the way our criminal justice system operates, something that looks and feels a lot like an era that we supposedly left behind, but have lacked the facts and data to back up their claims. It is my hope and prayer that this book empowers you and allows you to speak your truth with greater conviction, credibility, and courage. Last, but definitely not least, I am writing this book for all those trapped within America's latest caste system. You may be locked up or locked out of mainstream society, but you are not forgotten. People in this room, I know everyone here today, cares deeply about racial justice and the fate of people of color in the United States. There are many people in this room who are today mourning the loss of loved ones to the prison system. There are people here who have recently been released from prison, struggling to find jobs, find a place to sleep, find a way to feed themselves. There are people in this room who have lost loved ones to violence. Police violence and the violence is going on in our neighborhoods and our communities today. Violence that is the direct and predictable result of this new system of control. And I know there are many people in this room, advocates, who have been struggling, often at great sacrifice, to reform our criminal justice system, provide meaningful educational opportunities for our youth, and mentoring, and efforts to rebuild our communities. So this book is for you. It's not for the so-called mainstream white swing voter. It's not for those who don't yet care about racial justice. It's for those of us who care enough to make a difference for our loved ones, for our children, our children's children. And it's written for all those who have known or suspected that much more is going on in our communities than meets the eye. Those who have suspected that powerful forces have been operating to ensure that people of color remain locked in a permanent second-class status for life. Now, many people today don't want to hear this message. conversations and debates about race, much less racial caste, are treated like, yesterday's news. Political commentators, media pundits, say we've entered into this era of post-racialism. People in the United States and around the world have treated the election of Barack Obama as proof that we have put the final nail in the coffin of Jim Crow, that racial caste is part of our nation's history, but not our present. Well, this book challenges that racial narrative. Racial caste is not dead, it is alive and well in America. The systematic mass incarceration of poor people of color in the United States amounts to a new caste system, one that is specifically tailored to the political, social, and economic circumstances of our time. It is the moral equivalent of Jim Crow. Now, many people, find this claim hard to swallow, particularly those who have never spent time in prison or have been labeled a felon. They say that's absurd. That's absurd. And I myself rejected this idea more than 10 years ago, a fact I now regret. I describe in the introduction to my book that I first encountered the idea that something akin to a racial caste system was operating in the United States more than a decade ago when I was rushing to catch the bus and this bright orange poster caught my eye. It was stapled to a telephone pole. And on it, in large bold print, it read, "The drug war is the new Jim Crow." And it had been posted by a radical group that was organizing the new 3 strikes law that had been passed in California, the expansion of the prison system, police brutality. And it was being held, the meeting was being held at a small community church a few blocks away. And I remember thinking to myself, yeah, the criminal justice system is racist in a lot of ways, but it doesn't help to make such absurd comparisons. People just think you're crazy. And then I crossed the street, hopped on the bus, on my way to my new job as director of the Racial Justice Project, the ACLU. Well, when I began my work at the ACLU, I assumed that the criminal justice system had problems of racial bias, just like all our institutions, in society have problems of racial bias. I assumed it was the same sort of thing. Unconscious bias, conscious bias, racial stereotyping might be found, and it would produce serious consequences. I had been working as an employment discrimination lawyer suing Fortune 500 companies for gender and race bias, and I thought, well, I'll just take the tools that I've been using over here and apply them to eradicating racial bias in the criminal justice system and work with others to root out racial bias wherever it might rear its ugly head. Well, by the time I left the ACLU, I had come to realize that I was wrong, dead wrong about the criminal justice system. It's not just another institution in our society infected with racial bias, but a different beast entirely. The activists who post that sign on the telephone pole, they weren't crazy, nor were the smattering of activists and formerly incarcerated people around the country who had already begun to connect the dots between mass incarceration and earlier forms of racial control in the United States. So really, quite belatedly, I came to see that mass incarceration